Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
It is so great to be here with you today.
I am thrilled to have you, whether you are walking to class, maybe commuting to work, or just taking a moment to feed your curiosity. We have a phenomenal discussion lined up for you.
We really do.
We are turning our attention to a truly monumental piece of science communication. Today, we are exploring Carl Sagan's 1978 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Dragons of Eden. Speculations on the evolution of human intelligence.
I have to say, it's such a fascinating artifact of intellectual history.
Oh, absolutely.
Sagan essentially weaves together cosmology, evolutionary biology.
Neuroscience.
Right, neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, all of it really with this remarkably strong speculative streak.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when it comes to the mind and evolution, most of us walk around with a jumble of casual, comforting myths.
We do. We like our myths.
We tend to hold this vague belief that human beings have been around for a very long time.
Right.
And we also really like to believe that our rational side, our logic, our reason, is firmly and safely in the driver's seat of our actions.
Which is definitely a comforting thought.
Exactly. And finally, we often treat human intelligence as some kind of mysterious, unmeasurable gift.
Rather than a hard-won biological adaptation.
Yes. But Sagan
Actually,
actively pushes against those myths right out of the gate.
he doesn't hold back.
Not at all. He presents the reader with two very hard truths. First, that we are unimaginably recent arrivals in the grand scheme of cosmic time.
A blip?
A tiny blip. And second, that our rationality is deeply precarious. It's highly unevenly developed.
Which is unsettling.
It is. And to illustrate that first point, Sagan introduces one of his most brilliant conceptual tools, the cosmic calendar.
I do love the concept of the cosmic calendar as a visualization tool, but let me push back a little here.
Sure.
When you take the entire 13.8 billion year history of the universe
And collapse it into a single year. Right, a single calendar year.
Yeah.
Where the Big Bang happens at midnight on January 1st, human history looks incredibly tiny.
It barely registers.
In fact, all of recorded human history doesn't even appear until the final few seconds of December 31st.
The very last moments.
Doesn't that run the risk of making human existence seem totally insignificant?
I see what you mean.
It almost borders on cosmic nihilism. Why even bother if we are just a temporal blip?
That is a very common reaction, and it's a fair critique of that scale. But Sagan actually uses that temporal blip to pivot in the exact opposite direction.
Oh, how so?
Well, by starting his argument there, he quietly undermines a smug sense of human exceptionalism.
That arrogant idea that we are the ultimate goal of the universe.
Exactly, that we were preordained. But he doesn't leave us in despair.
Okay.
He defends a genuine human distinctiveness, but he grounds it entirely in our unique brain organization and our incredible capacity for symbolic thought.
So we might be recent arrivals.
But what we've managed to do with our biology in those last few seconds of the cosmic year is astonishing.
And that brings us to the core framework of the book. To explain that distinctiveness, Sagan relies heavily on a concept developed by neuroscientist Paul MacLean.
The triune brain model.
Yes, the triune brain. Sagan argues that the human brain is essentially a layered artifact of our evolutionary history. Can you break those layers down for us?
Absolutely. In this model, the brain is seen as having three distinct stacked layers, almost like an archaeological dig site.
Like digging through ruins.
Exactly. At the deepest, most primitive level, you have the reptilian complex, or the R complex.
The lizard brain.
The lizard brain. This part is associated with basic survival instincts: aggression, routine, territoriality.
Okay, so that's the base.
Right. Then, wrapped around that is the limbic system, which we inherited from early mammals.
And what does that handle?
That layer governs our emotions, our social bonding, and our nurturing instincts.
So mammals taking care of their young.
Precisely. And finally, sitting precariously on top of it all, is the neocortex.
The human part.
Yes, this is the massive outer layer responsible for language, abstract thought, and long-term reasoning.
Okay, wait. Let me see if I have this right. When someone abruptly cuts me off in traffic.
Oh, this is a great example.
Or when I'm fiercely guarding the last glazed donut in the break room. Is that my inner Jurassic Park taking the wheel?
Essentially, yes.
Am I basically letting a prehistoric lizard call the shots while my neocortex just sits there helplessly?
That is exactly the dynamic Sagan is trying to highlight. In his picture, human beings are essentially storytelling primates.
Storytelling primates. I like that.
We have these fragile, incredibly recently evolved rational capacities. The neocortex sitting on top of a much older, highly emotional, and highly territorial animal brain.
So my reaction to the driver cutting me off.
Is your R complex registering a territorial threat,
And my limbic system.
adding a surge of hot anger?
While my neocortex is frantically trying to rationalize why I should or shouldn't honk the horn.
Exactly. Our entire survival depends on learning exactly how to manage that turbulent inner ecology.
Here you describe this layered map of conflicting drives. It almost sounds like a biological version of Sigmund Freud's id, ego, and superego,
It really does.
with Sagan drawing that parallel on purpose.
What's fascinating here is that Sagan synthesized a massive range of 1970s science to do exactly this. He took cosmology, biology, sleep research,
Primate communication.
right, and he wove it into a highly readable narrative. He explicitly flagged his more speculative thoughts, even in the subtitle.
True, speculations on the evolution.
But yes, he is definitely operating in the same conceptual space as those sweeping psychologies.
But let's be real for a second. This book was published in 1978.
Almost 50 years ago.
Right. And my smartphone is obsolete after a year. So
Yeah.
how well does this science actually hold up?
That is the crucial question, and it points to the primary weakness of the book. The central scientific scaffolding, specifically MacLean's triune brain model, has aged rather poorly.
I suspected as much.
While it remains a highly evocative and useful metaphor, contemporary neuroscience has largely moved past it.
Because the brain isn't literally three separate brains stacked on top of each other.
Right. We now understand that brain functions are highly distributed and overlapping in complex neural networks.
So it sounds like Sagan fell into a fairly common methodological trap.
He did. In philosophy and science, this specific flaw is known as reification.
Reification. So basically, reification is when you take a really cool poetic metaphor.
Like the lizard brain.
Right. And mistakenly treat it like a literal physical map.
Precisely. It is the error of treating a vivid abstraction as a concrete reality. When Sagan speaks of a reptile, a mammal, and a human all reasoning within one skull, he is leaning heavily on metaphorical psychologies.
It's compelling imagery.
It is incredibly compelling, but it obscures the true complexity, the integration, and the plasticity of actual neural systems.
It's almost too neat.
Exactly. In fact, a famous review in Commentary magazine at the time accused Sagan of physiologizing his hunches.
Oh, wow. Physiologizing his hunches.
Meaning he was essentially borrowing the authoritative prestige of brain science to dress up his own philosophical speculations.
I suppose he did put the word speculations right there in the subtitle, so he was being somewhat intellectually honest.
He was.
But there's also a rather significant gap in his argument, especially given the era he was writing in.
Yes, the social context.
Right. Despite that ambitious subtitle about the evolution of human intelligence, Sagan largely ignored the fierce, highly polarized debates of the 1970s surrounding IQ.
And genetic heritability.
Exactly. And the environmental effects on learning.
You are entirely correct to point that out. The 1970s saw intense academic and public battles over what intelligence actually meant.
Whether it could even be quantified.
And how much of it was shaped by nature versus nurture. Critics have astutely noted that Sagan asks his readers to change their minds about almost nothing at the level of social or political commitments.
He keeps it very abstract.
Very. He offers a graceful, poetic reframing of intelligence as an evolutionary process, but he completely avoids wrestling with how that reframing might challenge rigid educational systems.
Or deeply entrenched socioeconomic inequalities.
He kept the discussion safely above the fray.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Even with those scientific and political blind spots, I think we have to acknowledge his immense talent as a communicator.
Oh, without a doubt.
He translates completely invisible neural structures into vivid, unforgettable phenomena. I want to spend some time on how he applies this to everyday things.
Like sleep.
Yes. For instance, he takes something as common as sleep and dreams and frames them through this evolutionary lens.
The chapters on sleep and dreaming are arguably some of the strongest in the book.
Because sleep is weird, right?
It is. From a pure survival standpoint, it makes almost no sense. You are lying unconscious and vulnerable to predators for a third of your life.
It seems like a terrible evolutionary strategy.
Right. But Sagan suggests that sleep and dreams reflect deep biological functions connected to memory consolidation and problem solving.
Okay.
But he goes further by linking the visual, hallucinatory nature of dreams to the older, nonverbal parts of our brain.
Right. He argues that when we dream, the neocortex is essentially powered down.
The rational supervisor is off the clock.
Exactly. And the limbic system and the art complex take over the theater of the mind.
Which explains so much.
It really does, especially when you think about the actual content of our dreams. So many of us have dreams about falling or running away from monsters.
Or showing up to a test completely unprepared.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
almost entirely fear, survival, and territorial anxiety. All the classic hits of the lizard and early mammal brain.
Exactly. The lack of logic and the high emotional intensity of dreams are the direct result of our ancient neural architecture running the show without the critical oversight of the rational neocortex.
And he doesn't just stop with human dreams.
No, Sagan also extends this evolutionary continuity outward by diving heavily into behavioral experiments with non-human primates.
Oh, the chimpanzee sign language experiments. That was groundbreaking at the time.
It was revolutionary. By exploring chimps like Washoe being taught American Sign Language, Sagan argues forcefully that there is a behavioral and cognitive continuity between our minds and theirs.
They weren't just doing tricks.
Right. These chimps weren't just mimicking gestures for treats, they were combining signs to create new meanings.
Demonstrating syntax.
A basic grasp of syntax and abstract categorization. Sagan uses this to prove that there is no absolute, unbridgeable gulf between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom.
Intelligence is a spectrum.
Exactly. Intelligence is an emergent property pushed by survival pressures, gradually leading to symbolic, future-oriented behavior across multiple species.
That completely changes how you look at the natural world. If intelligence isn't a magical gift handed down exclusively to humans, but a spectrum that we share with the apes, it forces a certain level of biological humility.
It really does. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can definitely see the Dragons of Eden operating in the same space as those sweeping early 20th century psychologies.
Like Freud and Jung.
Yes, you have Freud's structural model of the psyche, or Carl Jung's theories of collective archetypes.
Right.
Sagan's triune brain model functions in a remarkably similar way because it gives us a vocabulary to understand our inner conflicts. But here is the key difference.
What's that?
Sagan's version is aggressively naturalistic and anti-mystical. He is grounding our psychological conflicts in comparative anatomy and evolutionary biology rather than psychoanalysis.
Which makes it feel more tangible. But moving beyond the biology.
Yes.
So what does this all mean when we look at the trajectory of our species? How does this evolutionary history impact our future?
This brings us to the profound ethical center of gravity in the book. Sagan's primary worry is that our technological power has dangerously outrun our emotional maturity.
The technology moved faster than evolution.
Way faster. Remember that older R complex we discussed?
The reptilian brain tied to aggression and dominance.
Right. Sagan warns that if we allow those primitive impulses to wield modern weapons, the result will be devastating.
Which, considering the time he was writing.
Exactly. You have to remember he was writing during the height of the Cold War. The shadow of World War II was still very present. The doomsday clock was ticking.
It wasn't abstract for him.
Not at all. He was acutely aware that nuclear war or catastrophic ecological collapse were not just theoretical ideas. They were real probabilities if our territorial instincts went unchecked.
It is a terrifying thought. The finger hovering over the nuclear button belongs to a creature whose brain is still fundamentally wired for Pleistocene survival.
21st century weapons managed by ancient evolutionary fears.
Exactly. So what was his proposed survival strategy? Because we can't exactly surgically remove the R complex.
No, we cannot. But his proposed strategy was the deliberate, rigorous cultivation of the neocortex.
Exercising the rational brain?
Sagan believed our only viable path forward as a species is to actively champion science, critical thinking, and long-term foresight.
We have to purposefully exercise the forward-looking parts of our brain.
We have to build a culture that overrides our destructive, short-term impulses. We basically have to outthink our own biology.
That has huge implications for civic friendship and how we view justice today.
It really does.
Because if we treat human intelligence as an evolved, incredibly fragile achievement rather than a divine right, it radically shifts our perspective on each other.
How so?
Well, it implicitly and powerfully undermines racist and supernaturalist accounts that try to categorize human beings into higher and lower peoples.
Oh,
It
absolutely.
completely levels the playing field. We are all just clever animals. None of us are demigods.
Recognizing our shared precarious biological heritage encourages a democratic respect for universal human vulnerability.
We're all in the same boat.
We all share the exact same flawed brain architecture. When we see people fall into fear, aggression, or fierce political tribalism,
Which happens a lot.
understanding this evolutionary background ought to foster compassion and patience rather than pure contempt.
Because we recognize what's happening under the hood.
Right. We recognize that they are falling prey to the ancient drives of the limbic system and the reptilian complex, often exacerbated by environments of stress or scarcity.
That is a beautiful way to frame it. However, we do need to highlight the flip side of that framing, which ties back to his avoidance of 1970s politics.
The lack of institutional critique.
Exactly. Critics argue that Sagan places entirely too much weight on individual brain biology.
By focusing so heavily on the evolutionary history inside our own skulls, he sidesteps the structural reality of the world we actually live in.
He offers far too little critique of the institutions, the educational frameworks, and the justice systems that are desperately needed to heal our animal inheritances.
That is a vital point. Institutions matter. Social systems can either weaponize our lizard brain impulses,
Like algorithms that reward outrage.
or political systems that thrive on tribal fear. Or, conversely, those systems can help restrain them.
And Sagan largely leaves that institutional analysis out of the picture.
He treats intelligence almost exclusively as a matter of individual cognitive effort.
Which brings us to how we look at this text now.
Right. This raises an important question for you, the listener, regarding how you might discuss or debate this book with others today.
Because if the science is outdated and the political analysis is lacking, how do we fairly evaluate the book now?
The fairest way to approach the Dragons of Eden today is to read it as a highly suggestive, powerful narrative rather than a strict, literal neuroscientific textbook.
Focus on the metaphor.
Yes, the specific anatomical claims about the triune brain may be patchy or outdated, but the deeper philosophical invitation remains incredibly valuable.
The invitation to see ourselves clearly.
Understanding our inner conflicts as biological realities rather than moral failings is crucial, especially when we are navigating the complex issues of our modern era.
It forces you to look at every conflict, from a family argument to international diplomacy, and ask, which part of our brain are we feeding right now?
Exactly. Are we feeding the quick trigger, aggressive lizard?
Are we feeding the anxious tribal mammal?
Or are we feeding the reflective, analytical neocortex?
We must ask these questions without ever losing sight of our shared dignity and our potential to flourish together.
And the realization that our rationality is an ongoing project, not a finished product, is a deeply hopeful message.
It means we have agency.
Means we have agency in our own evolutionary story.
I think that is a brilliant framework to carry forward. As we bring our discussion to a close, we want to leave you, our listeners, with 3 open questions.
Something to mull over.
Exactly. These are questions you can carry into your own classrooms, think about during your commute, or bring to your next dinner table discussion. They build directly on Sagan's source material, challenging you to apply these concepts to the world around you.
I love these.
Question number 1. If our rational mind is indeed as fragile and as recently evolved as Sagan suggests, how should we intentionally design our social institutions, our justice systems, and our schools to systematically protect us from our own impulsive lizard brain drive?
That's a big one.
It is. Question number 2. Does viewing your own personal intelligence as a hard-won biological evolutionary adaptation rather than a magical unchangeable gift fundamentally change how you view your daily habits, your learning process, and your everyday decisions?
It shifts the perspective from fixed to flexible.
Exactly. And question number 3. In our current era, defined by incredibly advanced, rapidly accelerating technology, are we doing enough culturally to actively cultivate the neocortex skills of long-term foresight and critical thinking that Sagan argued are necessary for our survival?
Those are excellent questions. They demand that we take the abstract theories of evolutionary biology and apply them to our immediate lived reality.
They make the science personal.
But before we sign off, I think there is one final provocative thought we should leave the listener with, something Sagan couldn't have fully anticipated in 1978.
Oh, I like where this is going. What is the thought?
Well, if the brain evolved by adding layers, from the reptilian core to the mammalian limbic system to the human neocortex, what happens next?
That's the next layer.
Exactly. We're currently on the cusp of developing advanced brain-computer interfaces and integrating artificial intelligence, well, integrating incredibly advanced computing into our daily cognitive processes
We are essentially externalizing our memory.
and our processing power.
So you're asking if we are actively building a fourth layer of the brain, kind of technocortex.
Precisely. If the neocortex was our last major evolutionary hardware upgrade, our integration with technology might be the next layer.
Wow.
And if that is true, the question becomes, will this new technological layer help us finally tame the dragons of our ancient, impulsive brains? Or will it just give those ancient dragons unimaginably faster and more powerful tools to wage their territorial wars?
That is an incredible thought to end on. A technocortex built on top of a lizard brain.
Let's hope the neocortex stays in charge.
Let's hope so. We hope this exploration has given you a new lens through which to view your own mind, your evolution, and the world around you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this podcast. We always appreciate your curiosity and your dedication to learning. From all of us here at Mindful Moments, nourish your mind on the go. Have a wonderful day and keep questioning.